David J. Getsy is an art historian, writer, and curator whose projects have focused on queer and transgender tactics in artistic practice and in art historical methodologies. He teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he is the Goldebell McComb Finn Distinguished Professor of Art History and the interim director of the Low Residency MFA program. He has published 7 books, most recently Abstract Bodies, 60s Sculpture in the Expanded Field of Gender from 2015, and Queer from 2016, an anthology of contemporary artists' writings and Lambda Literary Award finalist. He curated the retrospective exhibition Rubbish and Dreams, the gender queer performance art of Stephen Varble for the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in 2018, as well as related exhibitions for Institute 193 in Lexington, Kentucky, and the One Archives Foundation Gallery in West Hollywood, California. His current research focuses on archive-based recoveries of forgotten queer and genderqueer performance art in the 1970s, and he is completing a book titled Queer Behavior, Scott Burton's Post-Minimalism and Performance in the 1970s. The title of David's talk this evening is The Possibility of Queer Abstraction. David.
I'd like to begin by celebrating the Des Moines Art Center for this history-making exhibition. It's an ambitious and unruly topic, as we'll talk about. And the museum the museum has created an exhibition that the city can really be proud of, and that's going to have an impact nationally and a legacy far beyond the time it's on view in the galleries. So I commend Jared Ledesma for this work on the show, which I know has come from innumerable conversations with the artists who were in it. And as well, I'm honored to be able to speak to you in the context of Pride Week. And I'm grateful for Capital City Pride for co-sponsoring the lecture and including it in all of the fantastic events. There's really a lot going on, so you've got a busy weekend ahead of you. Now, with our time today, I'd like to do 3 things. First, I'm going to introduce some of the general problems and questions and some of the concepts around the queer uses of abstraction and why we need to defend its possibility. Second, I'm going to discuss some precedents for the work in the show and some key works in American art of the post-war era, post-World War II. And I'm going to be focusing on a few objects from the Des Moines Art Center collection, so there'll be some greatest hits that you'll see again. Finally, I'm going to briefly discuss a number, but not all, unfortunately, of the artists in the exhibition to kind of give us a way into the work. So I know not everyone has seen the exhibition yet, but I hope you will. And this will sort of allow a different way into some of these objects. After that, we'll have a question and answer period, and no holds barred at that point. So y'all can. That's when you have to take over. So with that, let's begin. And here are 3 works from the show. The phrase queer abstraction sounds like a contradiction. On the one hand, we have the term abstraction, with its avoidance of representation and the ways in which it seems distant from the recognizable world of everyday objects. On the other, we have queer, a word that conjures bodies, protests, sexuality, love, and revolt. For over a century, those things called queer, that is, those people who love, desire, or live differently, be they called lesbian, bisexual, gay, or just queer, those people who have struggled to gain political visibility and to establish the right to live and love otherwise than the supposed normal that we were told about. Central to LGBT social movements has been the demand that clusters around the word and the political activist use of the word queer to be seen and to make oneself visible. How then might we correlate these 2 contradictory things, this desire for abstraction, the removal from the world, with this embrace of a political and social idea that demands that we be seen and be represented? Now, part of this, the way out of this as a contradiction, which ultimately it's not, is in the concept of queer itself. Now, while this word is often used interchangeably with lesbian, gay, or bisexual, I'd like to talk about it in a slightly more complex way. This word captures the experience of being told one is wrong and one is outside the normal. It's an insult, remember, at first. Queer, in other words, names an experience of someone being seen differently, even though they may look like everyone else. And that's how that insult is used often. It's this question of the problems of being visible that are central to the exhibition and the artists take up in very different ways. The reclamation of the insult, queer, as a badge of defiance and honor became a central part of the activism of the 1980s and 1990s in response to government inaction over the ongoing AIDS crisis. Queer activists refused to be invisible and as well refused to disappear into looking normal, even if they were tolerated, and that's a big if. Instead, these activists created loud and rebellious agitprop that demanded visibility. These in-your-face tactics were a response to the erasure of lesbian, gay, and bisexual and trans lives. This approach to representation was an approach that demanded that we be counted, be seen, and be visible. And refusing to go unseen, these queer activists made themselves instantly recognizable and defiant. Now, this might be the style and imagery that we might associate with the idea of queer. But how then do we understand an abstract version of this? Now, it would be incorrect to merely see the queer use of abstraction as a stepping away from these politics or a kind of self-denial. Rather, the artists who explore abstraction have done so precisely because of the ways that it makes it difficult to immediately see and immediately know the questions around sexuality or who one is. And so one of the things that many artists do who are beginning to think through these questions are wonder about the stakes of visibility. How making oneself visible, making oneself recognizable, standing up and being counted are good on one hand, but they also make one the target of surveillance, of scrutiny, of intrusive questions, and sometimes violence. And this is one of the problems of the politics of visibility, is that it does good things in the world, but it also, sometimes being visible is self-endangering. Queer abstraction takes up some of these problems and tries to think through the ways in which tactics of invisibility, camouflage, infiltration, and dissemblance might be activated in differently political ways. So I don't want to, I'm showing all this kind of fantastic work from the 1990s. I don't want to say that this is in opposition to the kind of work you're seeing in the galleries. They're two different ways of dealing with the problematics of the demand to be visible and the stakes of that visibility. And queer abstraction's priorities often emerge from this suspicion of representation, from a striving to vex visual recognition, and for a desire to find a more open and variable mode of imaging and imagining relations. Now, a queer abstraction, as I'm going to show with some historical examples, can hide in plain sight, can work its way across the obstacles of homophobia, and can code switch to speak directly to queer audiences without others knowing. These are all the different forms of queer subversion, and they work hand in hand with these more in-your-face tactics and the demand for representation. More than anything else, however, artists use abstraction queerly in order to prompt us to see differently, to imagine otherwise, and to ask how we might reconsider the forms that are given to us. That's ultimately what is political about queer abstraction, as I'm going to argue. And it shows us that a given form has more than one way to be and to relate in the world. Now, I recognize that this discussion of queer abstraction is itself a little abstract at this moment. So, but I wanted to get it out of the way so we can dive into the work. So the way I'm going to do that is to start to turn to the history of art, which is a remarkable resource for considering problems of representation and of visibility. And this question of how one might see a queer topic, how one might recognize what is a work of art made by a lesbian or gay artist. These are big problems, and in fact, the defining problems for what we think of as the discipline of the history of art. Because you have to ask yourself, how do you recognize a work by a lesbian artist or a gay artist? What are you looking for? How do you know? The problem is a central one for LGBT history, as it has fought against the attempts to erase queer lives and to make visible queer love, family, and kinship. In this, again, the history of art has played a central role, and many of the earliest thinkers, scholars, and activists who were demanding what we would today call LGBT rights were engaged with the history of art for questions of evidence. So I want to mention just this very briefly, but I think it's important, is that some of these concerns started in the 18th and 19th centuries as scholars and activists started to argue that there was an identity and that rights were attached to it for those who loved the same sex. And in this, the history of previous representations was one of the main things that they looked to. So we have thinkers like Johannes Winkelmann, Edward Carpenter, Walter Pater, Havelock Ellis, and John Addington Symonds, who are writing at the end of the 18th and the end of the 19th century, who all make cases for what we would today call LGBT rights. But they did so through finding evidence in the history of art. But when they looked at the history of art, they encountered some of the same problems we might. Sometimes you just kind of have a feeling about a work. Sometimes you think there's a different lingering attention to the male body by a male artist, but is that evidence? And this is the problem that many of these writers were thinking about as a central problem for the history of art, is how do we understand intention and how do we think about works of art that seem to speak to us across the centuries? Now, this is, of course, crucially important for those people who feel alone and who are looking for questions of community. And we have to remember that something fantastic like Capital City Pride and all of these events are a visual testament to the fact that one is not alone. But in previous historical moments, that same recognition was not there. And so many people looked backward into history to find people that they believed, sometimes imagined, and sometimes just knew in their gut were like-minded. And so we have the early art historians looking to the Renaissance, to an artist like Donatello, and seeing in that wonderfully cocky hip of Donatello something like a wink, something that's not the conventional representation of a male nude, but something else. And this in turn gets taken up by other artists. And so we have a later artist such as Hamo Thornycroft, a British sculptor, who is again adopting this. And then this statue in particular becomes instrumental in the work of John Addington Symonds, a writer who is one of the first in a European context to argue for a gay identity and legal and ethical rights attached to it by looking at this chain of images that goes back to an initial object that we might only have a hunch about. And I show, of course, that there's the famous Flandrin that's taken up by other artists as well, that again, the question of the artist's intention is very ambiguous, but its reception by subsequent artists and viewers as a queer object has been crucial to history. So I mention this because it's one of the problems that we're going to see throughout some of this work is that we're not always going to have verifiable visual evidence. Sometimes it's merely whether or not a work of art allows a queer identification rather than refusing to allow it. And that's a wonderfully muddy area. And that's one of the things that makes queer abstraction so interesting, because you don't just know it when you see it. Sometimes it sneaks up on you, as we'll see. One of the effects, though, of this searching for evidence and the chains of citations through which a kind of queer art history began to develop is that in the 20th century, when the things that we think of as queer art, gay art, or lesbian art tend to have a very narrow set of allowable images. And they usually involve erotically available bodies, images of couplings, and so forth. And so when we think of someone who's, for instance, iconic of gay art at the end of the 20th century, an artist like Robert Mapplethorpe, one of the reasons that so much energy, both positive and negative. I'm thinking of all of the censorship battles of the 1980s and 90s that swirled around Mapplethorpe's work. part of that energy is because Mapplethorpe represents the heir of a tradition of trying to work out something that's verifiable as a gay symbol. And this involves often, again, the representation of couplings, the representation of nude bodies, and the questions of the erotic. But there's plenty of room for this kind of work, but there's, of course, these kinds of imagery do not represent the full complexity of a life, let alone the diversity of individual lives. Being queer is not something that just happens when one is at home or in the nude, right? It's part of daily life. And so how does one manifest the complexity of the hour-by-hour life in a different way? Sometimes representation doesn't cut it. Sometimes artists began to realize that there were different things that needed to be said that couldn't be hinged on the representation of a body or the depiction of sex. And that's one of the things that many of the artists tried to think about. So with that, I'm going to move to the second section. And again, I know we haven't seen much work, but I'm trying to set things up so that we're more fluid at the end. Now I'm going to talk about some key precedents in American art for the work in the show, and that focus particularly on the question of how abstraction can operate. And there's going to be a few key themes. First of all, it's going to be artists who use code and coding. Second of all, it's going to be like the Thornycroft and the Donatello, a series of citations of previous work. And third, there's going to be questions of camouflage and infiltration. And this all results in a more open-ended account of how we might imagine a different way into some of this work. A classic example, a kind of founding one that Jared mentions in his essay in the catalog, is Marsden Hartley. There's some great Hartleys that are on view right now, but I wanted to show this one in particular. Hartley is an American artist who's working in Germany in the years just before World War I and after, and he is using the language of cubism and abstraction, but he's also trying to figure out a way to represent love. And this is a portrait of a German officer who was his partner, Karl von Friedrich, and the ways in which he could represent this, again in a time when representation of same-sex love was not allowed, that couldn't be openly represented and that would result in reprisal, is by coding in the work. And so at a very early stage, just as abstraction is being invented, he codes different things, including Karl von Friedrich's initials. He was a German military officer, so you see different military insignia in there. And many of the scholars of queer abstraction look to this work in particular as starting us off in a new direction, of talking about how the openness of abstraction, the fact that it's in the invention of a new formal language, is also a way to hide in plain sight, and to allow for very personal content to be presented openly without giving everything away. Because there should be no demand that we disclose everything about our lives at once. And this sort of coding is important. Hartley would later return to figuration and do other works that sometimes do partake of the erotically available, or that are other representations of love. So his portrait of Adelard is about a man who he loved, who was lost at sea. And so there's other ways in which he was returning to some of this imagery without abstraction. So I'm just going to point this out to remind us that abstraction isn't like a religion. You can actually pivot back and forth between abstraction and figuration, and it's okay. And so he's one of the people who does that. But even though these works might seem more like the Mapplethorpes, it's really this question of coding from this earlier work that begins to take hold. And there's other artists, especially after World War II, during the Cold War, when there's a series of reprisals against gay men and lesbians in particular, the Lavender Scare, in which there were routings out of homosexuals from all government offices in the FBI in the 1950s, and a period of deep social repression. Gay artists like Jasper Johns produced works that also turned to abstraction and to coding. And so this is, of course, one of the great masterworks of the collection here. And so I had to talk about it. And this work, Tennyson, it works in code to frustrate our attempt to read it and to know it from first blush. It declares its willful obscurity and interiority. Now let's remember, and you should go see it down in the galleries, that the central element is a piece of canvas that has been folded over and then painted on top of. And so it tells us as we're looking at it that there's something hidden inside it. And so this here, and again, hopefully if you've seen it, this is actually a fold, and this piece of canvas comes over. So what it, from a distance, might appear like a monochrome starts to show us all of the things that it's hiding within it. But like much of Johns' work from the 1950s and early 60s, this was a means to discuss and represent his a certain kind of autobiographical content, in particular his same-sex relationship with the artist Robert Rauschenberg. In particular, the folding of the canvas is a reference to his partner Rauschenberg's bed, which is a kind of key work in 20th century art because it changes the idea of what we think of as the canvas as a window and tries to play with it. And the bed itself is an image of intimacy that Johns cites between the two. And these are two who are working together very closely. But more particularly, Johns' title, which is emblazoned across the bottom, of Tennyson, is a reference to Lord Alfred Tennyson's most widely read work, the 1849 In Memoriam AHH, in which the poet lamented the loss of his friend Arthur Henry Hallam. Now, this poem is often taken to be a key document in the history of homoeroticism because it discusses an ardent love of one man for another. And so through this kind of coding, this work that doesn't seem to offer itself to us is actually, through its lateral references to the works that are produced around it, Rauschenberg's bed, and to the source for it, allow us to see that there's a different kind of homoerotic content in this work. Now, Johns' work provides a coded set of references about the love of these men for each other, but remember, it does so in a work that refuses to let us see that immediately. And that refusal isn't a denial, it's a defiant. The queerness of this work is not in its being visible or being recognizable as such, but rather in the ways in which it hints at such queer associations, while nevertheless not allowing us to intrude upon it. For gay artists working in the homophobic time of the Lavender Scare and the criminalization of homosexuality, such a practice was both necessary and revolutionary. Johns' queer abstraction is a model, in turn, for many other artists who want to make work about their lives, but don't want to reveal too much for doing so. And this idea of infiltration is a kind of key that we'll come back to. And some artists do this also with great effect. So I want to talk about another infiltrating queer work that might be recognizable to you. Robert Indiana's Love painting and related works have become iconic and widely disseminated. They circulate across the globe and continue today. Here, Indiana, in various forms, here's a painting and a sculpture of the same composition, has been, the word love has been compacted into two lines of two characters each touching the next. In this way, the letters themselves become a little bit more abstracted, and we start to see parallels between their forms. Look at the way the L and the E start to echo each other, and we start to pay attention to things that are that we might otherwise look through or look past. In and amongst the intimacy of these squashed together letters, however, Indiana has remarked that his primary interest was in, quote, the circle still called to mind by the tilted O, unquote. Nestled in this word, this odd letter, with its orientation that's a little bit off, that's a little bit askew, nevertheless makes sense to us in that context. We have no problem reading the word love, even though that O is not like the ones that we're told are proper. Even though this O is a deviation, we still accept the ways that it contributes to love. A queer letter, you might say, and a subtle way of asking us to accept the unorthodox or the odd. Now, I'm not going to go into the full history of this work, but it's quite interesting because it It's worth noting that the first versions of this composition were made in 1964 on the heels of a breakup with his long-term partner, Ellsworth Kelly. And actually, out of the anger and heartbreak of that episode, originally this composition was not the word love. It was a different four-letter word that starts with F. But then, trying to, when life gives you lemons, you gotta make lemonade. He transposed that anger into a more general, the more general composition of love. Now, one of the issues, this is two painters who are in a relationship. One of the issues that precipitated their breakup was actually the question of abstraction. Ellsworth Kelly, we'll talk about in just a second, was defined in that art should not represent anything, but Robert Indiana was introducing words and texts which were not representations, but were still recognizable. And this was one of the things that caused the rift. And so, again, during the breakup, it's this defiant assertion of a word. Now, as well, the coding of the colors and the compositions also are a canny reference to the works that were being made in the studio in close proximity to Indiana's own. And so there's this connection between these works that might not immediately make itself apparent, but is nevertheless part of the intimacies of artistic production that are being produced. And we have, when we dive into the history, and Indiana talks about this. When we dive into the history of this work, we see that a work that is now universally accepted as an image of love, that sculpture in New York, there's constantly tourists having happy snapshots next to it, right? This is an infiltration of queer content and of queer heartbreak into the world. And we've come to accept it as everybody's love, even though it comes from this source. That's infiltration. Now, let's turn to Kelly a little bit, because here's another artist who seems so removed from the content of love, politics, or anything else. And even though the work is not overtly political, it still rubs up against some of these issues. Now, Kelly's often taken to be one of the primary examples of American abstraction, hard-edge abstraction as it's called. And he's one who, in his pure simplicity, many have a really difficult time with. There seems to be no there sometimes when we look at a Kelly, but that's exactly the point. His works are remarkably simple, and they emerge from seeing the world differently. When we look at a work like Rebound, there's hardly anything there, right? We have, depending on how you look at it, there's two concave triangles touching each other, or two convex forms touching each other, or reaching for each other. We can look at the same composition in two ways, but either way you look at it, it's about that touch, that moment of reaching for and overlapping with. This is a remarkably erotic abstraction, I would make the case, and this is actually something that's been picked up in the literature, is that even though there is no representation of the body, what it does is distill and thematize that moment of touching, of contact, when two bodies reach towards each other or touch each other. That is something that is beyond the simple representation of an individual body, which may not look like or work like the one that you have. And so we're limited by that. But Kelly and Indiana are both searching for a more open vocabulary to talk about things like intimacy or love in a way in which all of us, in all of our differences, can identify in one way. And we identify precisely because of the openness of abstraction, rather than the limitations of seeing a recognizable figure. Now, I love Ellsworth Kelly's work, and here's one of the great Ellsworth Kellys again from here. And while a work like Rebound we can talk about in this figurative sense, we also have to remember that the ways in which Kelly works also are informed by a queer experience in a different way. Many of these relentlessly simple compositions, Kelly finds in the world by paying attention to shadows, by looking at the space inside a doorway, by seeing how there's chance elements of the visual world that are often overlooked, looked through, or considered to be unimportant. And so he'll take a shadow, a form from a leaf, or something else, and then simplify it and explode it onto the canvas with these vibrant colors. And so what you look at when you're looking at one of these works is the image that he has seen that everyone else has overlooked in the world. He doesn't tell us what these are. We have no idea whether this yellow protuberance or this enveloping blue field, we have no idea what the source material is, and he makes sure of that. He often works from photographs of things like shadows, and then will simplify and take that form and turn it and bring it into this kind of realm of the positive image in a bright color. So we don't need to know what it once was, but one of the things that's important about Kelly is that his works are these bold visualizations of things that are often seen to be invisible, that are often looked past. If you look around the room, you'll see a number of shadows that you haven't paid attention to until I tell you to start paying attention to the shadows. And here is exactly that problematic that Kelly's thinking about. Now, this work doesn't represent intimacy, it doesn't represent sex, it doesn't represent love, it doesn't do anything like that, but it does represent the experience. It does thematize the experience of being overlooked and looked past, or perhaps of looking for something that no one else is. And this is a queer experience that comes from that daily encounter with everyone else on the street and wondering if one's difference is made visible, trying to look for other people who might share your difference, and all of the problematics of visuality that are attended to under the endurance of the normal by people who fall outside of the normal. So again, there's a kind of queer mood to a lot of these works, even if when we look at it, we won't necessarily think about that or see that at first. And one of the things that's important about all of these artists is they're not trying to limit the audience and trying to just speak to like-minded viewers, but rather they're using this experience of difference, of maybe being that askew O in a word, and trying to figure out a way to have a general conversation around all of the things that are there. And so one of the things that's remarkable about works like this and many of the works in the show is that they take an experience of oppression, of difference, of feeling abnormal, and use it not just to kind of shore up that identity, but use it to question the ways in which we expect things from the world and ask us to see differently. There are a number of different artists who do this as well. I'm going to just run through a couple and then we're going to get to the show. But the work of Agnes Martin is a great example. She's someone who also turned away from making paintings of her female lovers to starting to do paintings of pure abstraction. She and Ellsworth Kelly had breakfast every morning when they lived in New York. Robert, Indiana lived on a different floor. They were part of a community of queer abstract artists who were trying to figure out a different way to produce imagery that didn't disclose too much. And so her meditative grids are a way of doing that. There's other artists who are also turning away from the problems of being visible. And here, Alfonso Osorio and Beaufort Delaney both correlate this question with questions of race and racism, thinking about the ways in which they were visually marked because of their race and turning to abstraction as a way out of that. And for both of them in particular, this is interfaced with their experience of also worrying about visibility in terms of their sexuality. We can look to lesbian artists such as Louise Nevelson and Nancy Grossman, who take objects from the everyday world, found discarded objects, and give them a new life and unify them in different ways so they start looking like each other, even though they may have come from very different places. These are all different ways in which aspects of queer experience are distilled into works that don't represent the world, but nevertheless allow us to communicate back and forth with it. The one final work that I want to talk about from the DMAC collection before we talk about the show is one that's very close to my heart. Jared mentioned I'm writing a book about Scott Burton. And so everyone who's been to the restaurant and outside in the lovely courtyard, you may have seen this bench, right? You may not have known it's a work of art. You may have looked at it, noticed it doesn't look very comfortable, and just kind of went on your day. Maybe you sat down at it. Maybe you tried to have your lunch at it. But it doesn't, again, It doesn't particularly appear very arty. It doesn't seem to say anything. And when we look at it, we might just think it's a piece of quite blocky public furniture that's just placed there. Scott Burton was an artist who was deeply interested in questions of queer experience, and he started making work in the year of Stonewall, and began to think in particular about behavior and questions of how we communicate nonverbally and how queer experience involves looking with intent for other signs of evidence. He was really serious about this. He started reading all of the cybernetic literature on behavioral psychology and studied the ways in which we communicate through body language, through proximity, through facial gesture, and all of this. He was thinking about the ways in which all of these signs happen below the realm of representation. Not what we say, but what we do with our body positions, with our face, with our gestures when we say it. For him, this was important because he was deeply invested and interested in the practice of cruising, which is wandering, through the streets and hoping to potentially find someone who shares your interest or desire. And this was a crucial activity for many gay men, especially in the 1960s and 70s, especially in New York, where Burton was working. So he was interested in all these questions of being invisible, hiding in plain sight, but finding others who might be looking for the same thing. And as this went on, Burton became much more interested in the different sexual cultures of 1970s New York, including the leather and S&M communities. And the work that he started producing in the 1980s comes out of this mix of queer sources. So when you ignore this bench, when you walk past it, when you use it, you turn your back on it, you sit on it, everything else. For Burton, this was a way of manifesting S&M dynamics, of being the masochist in plain sight. And so you actually affect the work. You enact it by ignoring it, by using it. So very much like the questions of sexualized power dynamics in S&M, this is a work that takes that kind of passivity and celebrates it as potential. Also, a work like Burton's hides in plain sight. He said, I don't care if people know my work is art at all. And some people will just use it and have their lunch on it and go about their thing. But if you know what you're looking for, when you see a Burton, then you get a glimmer in your eye, and you think, aha, there's one. That's the experience of cruising that's also transposed into the dynamics of Burton, who became one of the most important public sculptors in America in the 1980s with works like these. And so this is a work that comes from this engagement with queer experience, queer histories, queer communities, and sexual subcultures. But yet it transposes that into these works that might never be seen as such unless you know what you're looking for. For Burton, however, this again, like Indiana, like Kelly, like Marsden Hartley, was not about creating a narrow audience for the work, but actually about thinking more openly about what this work can do, how it can question the terms that we expect of things. So for Burton, he was interested in making work that also played with questions of power by opening itself up across class lines and making work that anyone can understand, even if you know nothing about art, or even recognize if it's art. This is a deeply generous piece, because you don't need to know anything about art to enjoy it. And for Burton, this was something that came out of his understanding of questions of politics, where he took a queer experience of being outside and thought about not just finding others who are outside, but questioning the border between inside and outside. So he ends up making a work that's deeply generous, and at the same time, I hope I've convinced you, a little bit sexy too. Now, okay. When we start turning to other works that are more contemporary, this is another work in the DMAC collection of Felix GonzalezTorres. By now, you should have been primed. You can do a whole thing. You can talk about intimacy, the erotics of sameness, all of this with a work that it's simply two circles abutting next to each other. This is a fantastic work in the collection. It'll come back in a bit. Now, when we start talking about some of the works in the show, again, I wish I could talk about all of them. I'm going to have to talk about them somewhat briefly. but I just want to do a tour through them to kind of give you some terms to be thinking about it. So we look at the work of Harmony Hammond, arguably one of the kind of core queer abstract artists for many decades. This work, Chenille No. 2, is a monochrome that the more we look at it, the more we start to see depth, we start to see things inside it. And very much Hammond is interested in that dynamic between something that looks very concrete, we can break apart its constituent elements, but at the same time it starts to be more than that. And she says about this work, quote, "In their refusal to be any one thing at the same time, they are themselves. The paintings can be seen to occupy some sort of fugitive queer space, and in doing so remain oppositional," unquote. So it's part of the heir to the works such as John's and others, but she's pushing it in a new direction. In particular, what I love about a Harmony Hammond are the grommets that are like hidden in and amongst many of the paintings. Now, the grommet is a fantastic thing because it's a reinforced whole that takes canvas and turns it into something useful and malleable. Canvas is often seen to be the ground for painting, the support, the thing that's underneath of it. It's even talked about in the history of art as the matter or the body sometimes. And so Hammond is playing with this, and she has all of these grommets hidden in chenille, not hidden, but buried in chenille, that when we start looking at them, sometimes may give us a figurative resonance of a series of nipples, but also we have to remember that they're playing up this idea of the importance of that piercing of the canvas and that reinforced whole as a different kind of imagery, and one that is speaking differently about the history of art and its emphasis on the canvas. So again, sometimes it takes a little unpacking for these works to have these larger queer, and in Hammond's case also feminist, content revealed, but it's there to be found. Another great example is the work of Prem Sahib, who makes works that play with moments from the history of minimalism and retake some of those forms. These works are all done in a bathroom tile, a kind of tile that would be very familiar to anyone who cruised bathrooms looking for other like-minded people. And these works take those dynamics and put them into the kind of public space of the art gallery. This is part of a series called Watch Queens, which is a really art historically canny thing. So the watch queen in a cruising scenario is someone who watches but doesn't partake, but also stands on guard for people who might intrude upon the action that's happening in the enclosed space. And so the watch queen is exactly the figure of someone who is producing a visual relationship and allowing covert things to happen. And so when you look at a work like Outerwear, which again is its own pun here, when you encounter this work, it seems at first very simple, but it's a way in which there's, even in this form, an inside and outside. When you go look at this, pay attention to the fact there's two very different kinds of tiles being used. One is highly reflective on the inside. It's almost like a mirror. You can see yourself when you're standing in that narrow space between, whereas the outside, it's opaque. So there's a way in which it, again, takes some of the dynamics of a sexual culture and plays them out in a different way through this work that also cites and remakes a heroic form of minimalism. There's another Prem Sahib work I always like that's not in the show that again, but I think it's a great example. It's simply called Two Dots, and it might again seem like a very abstract form, but you should already recognize a reference to Felix GonzalezTorres, and in particular, the work in the DMAC is also a reference to this work, Perfect Lovers, which is two battery-powered clocks that are placed next to each other. The batteries die at different times, and so the clocks will slowly become out of sync. And this was GonzalezTorres' poetic way of thinking about the inevitable disparity that happens over the course of a relationship. So again, simple, but opens up to really complex emotions. It's also done it through this question of sameness, not difference, between these two forms. Sahib is looking to that, but he also is creating a work that's very particular to his community. He lives in London, and For some viewers, they would walk into the exhibition and just see 2 dots. Others would see Felix GonzalezTorres, and other people would also see the rapid HIV antibody test that was just recently made available when this work was initially being made, that in which 2 dots indicated that one was HIV positive. So this is a work that, again, speaking in code to different audiences in overlapping ways, and is saying different things to the different kinds of viewers who come into the exhibition. And that's very much a component of much queer abstraction, is, again, it's allowing itself to be part of the general public, at the same time speaking beneath it. Or you can look at works, there's also a fantastic group of works that appear to be mirrors with condensation on them. These don't photograph at all. Again, go see the exhibition. But when you look up close at them, this is kind of more what they look like. Sahib said he first came up with this idea when he was in line at a nightclub for the bathroom. And there's all these people in line waiting, and it was sweaty and humid and everything, and the mirror was covered with condensation, and someone on their way out brushed it as they went by, and it produced a gesture that looked like an abstract expressionist painting. But it was also this moment of intimacy and contact between bodies, even when they didn't touch, through the condensation. And he took this imagery as this remarkable evidence of that community of the nightclub, at the same time the ways in which bodies leave traces in different ways. So there's a great group of 3 of these paintings by Sahib in the exhibition. Another fantastic work that you should be incredibly proud is here and has been remade for this exhibition is Tom Burr's Deep Purple. Now, Burr is an artist who appropriates and takes on the forms and content of previous art as a way of distancing, bracketing, and commenting on them, and using them in different ways. This itself is kind of a queer practice, and it's been called akin to questions of, say, camp or reuse. And with this work, Deep Purple, Burr takes on arguably one of the most important and famous of public sculptures of the 20th century, Richard Serra's Tilted Arc. This is a huge piece of steel. It's 37 meters long, that's 120 feet, that was placed in the Federal Plaza in downtown Manhattan. And it's a big curved steel wall. And I'm not going to go into the reasons for Serra doing this work. They're complex and interesting. But it was specifically made for this plaza, and people hated it. So it got in their way. They thought it was authoritarian, and all of the workers who were in the buildings around the plaza began to protest, and this became one of the flashpoints of the 1980s in debates about art and public funding. And this was a major series of events, and there were lawsuits and trials in which many artists and critics and others got on stage to defend this work and talk about it. And it became, in part of the culture wars of the 1980s, a place where the idea of public culture was contested. So it's a very important work. It was, again, specifically made for this site, and ultimately the work was removed, not destroyed, but removed. It's now in a warehouse in Jersey, I think. But Richard Serra says, it was made for that site, it can't go anywhere else. If you remove it, I consider it destroyed. And so this is a work that, after it was removed, and this doesn't really happen as often with this kind of public art, it becomes lost. We only know about it now in its absence. And here are some images of the deinstallation and destruction of it and the scar that's left. Now, when Burr remakes this object that was supposed to be permanent, it was supposed to be around forever. This is a public work paid for by public funds that was supposed to stay. It's supposed to be part of the civic life of the city, but it was immediately, but it was lost. It was taken away, and the only thing that was left of it was its absence. Burr understood that this also coincided with the first decade of the AIDS crisis. And the work, in its bringing back to life, even in a kind of temporary, partial way, of this object that was lost, that we can see the gap where it once was, and we think about it. This is very much for Burr informed by the mourning of the AIDS crisis and thinking through the problems of loss. And we have to remember, especially across the United States, that the AIDS crisis devastated the art world and also the viewers of art. And so we had a huge loss of the cultural life of the nation due to government inaction in this decade. And Burr's Deep Purple at first seems playful, and it is in certain ways, but it's also deeply serious because it's a reminder of the things that we thought were permanent that no longer are. When we look at it as well, though, this is manifested in the fact that it's not a big piece of steel, but rather it's a series of these wooden constructions that take the same form. It creates a front and a back. It creates a space. He likes to use it to divide spaces and provide divisions and places of intimacy. The brilliant installation of this work cutting through the window and into the pool is fantastic because it shows that that Burr is not just giving us that content of mourning and sadness, but also thinking about the ways in which this now temporary, impermanent, but also mobile and flirtatious object can be in different spaces and can do different things and makes you look at that same space in different ways. So it's kind of giving us this queer bracketing, distancing, or recharacterization in two different ways. We can also look to a work like Mark Bradford's, which specifically also cites the AIDS crisis. This is a work that at first seems abstract, but is actually an enlarged version of the attack of the virus onto T cells. But it was created through a practice in which layers of paper were laid down and then scraped away, so that when you go and look at it, the surface of the painting evokes the wound and evokes the difficulty of arriving at this image that happens through the destruction of the surface of the canvas rather than the building up of paint. So again, this is work that might at first seem decorative or pretty, but that when we actually think about how it came into the world and what its sources are, it speaks to different aspects of histories that are sometimes made invisible and need to be defended. The same questions of visibility are also manifest in a work like Matheus Bass. This work here, and you can kind of think about this in relationship to the Kelly. Here we don't know, again, if this is a framing blue doorway in which we see a landscape or horizon line beyond it, or if this is a monumental protruding form that has a blue sky behind it. It's both and neither of those things, and Bass is really interested in making works that play between the different possibilities and give us different ways of seeing the same thing in other ways. And in particular, Bass and many other artists in the exhibition play this out not just in terms of questions of queer communities or sexuality and invisibility, but also through gender, which is another thing that we never know someone's gender from looking at their body or their exterior, right? Gender is something that is complex and that is sometimes correlates with the bodies we're given, but sometimes does not. And Bass's work that is about seeing things in multiple ways when you're seeing the same thing is a way of thematizing some of these questions. Sometimes these works are a little more explicit and fun. So this may look like the representation of a face with sunglasses on, or it could look like an image of penetration. You can decide. Fun in the sun either way. Now let's. Sometimes you gotta. Okay. Just to go through a couple other works. Elijah Berger has this floor painting that one can walk across and things like this. And in this, it's a citation of other works, such as Carl Andre's works that you can also walk across. But this, it's important to note, is a ritual object and one that comes from Berger's deep investment in thinking through questions of ritual and indeed magic. Berger's practice involves the creation of spells. And that's how he thinks about these works. And he's looked back to a history of magic in the 20th century, and in particular the practice of making what's called a sigil. And the sigil is a way of taking a word, taking a wish, and breaking apart the forms of the letters and making it into a symbol that then becomes the manifestation of this wish. Now, this is something that's Burger didn't invent, that is part of the kind of literature on magic throughout the 20th century, which he takes very seriously. But one of the things that Burger does is takes this idea and thinks of it in two different ways. First, the practice of making a sigil is literally a practice of abstraction, of taking something recognizable and making it unrecognizable and making it hide it in plain sight. But second, Burger's works are, again, sincere in their understanding of magic. And this might at first seem like an easy thing to put to one side, but there are many artists who think about magic not in relationship to queer experience as a way of seeing the world differently, of imagining the world as how you want it, of producing power in the world by believing that one can do something through one's actions. And so there's a number of artists who think about magic as a way of manifesting a kind of queer resistance. And Burger is very much part of that. And some of these works become remarkably beautiful and complex, and they're all based on a series of wishes that he will never reveal to us, but nevertheless become these forms. He started to, in relationship to other artists and in communities in which he was working, he would start to take this practice and make it no longer personal and intimate and private, but make it collective. And he started doing these works that are on drop cloths and canvases on the floor. This is actually a colored pencil image of someone working on one of these floor things, so I thought it did two things, because Burger, like other artists, pivots between abstraction and figuration. But what's good about this is you can see the context for these works is that they are not intended just to be paintings. They're not just formal, but actually they're evidence of this act of wishing, and in the floor works, wishing collectively through a community. This work, which was created for this exhibition, is highly planned, and you can see some of the preliminary drawings, but it still speaks to this idea of producing a space for queer encounter and for also imagining otherwise. It's a space of power in the ways in which Elijah's thinking about it. And so, again, this is something that may not immediately be visually manifested in the work, but is nevertheless very much the part of how he intends your experience of merely walking across it. And here you can think to the Scott Burton as a counterpart. The work of J. Jumong takes a work of 1970s pornography that was at the center of a legal battle around censorship, and turns it into this wonderfully absurd, campy, exuberant object that you can vaguely see some of the imagery that has been printed onto the fabric out of which these tubes has been made. But instead, Jumong creates a work that processes these once scandalous images, and they weren't actually all that scandalous, but that were the site of legal battles, and turns them into something else, into a new, different version of the absurd body that's not limited to those images, but rather pushing beyond it. A similar account in Sheila Pepe, whose oversewn object with different things, again, takes things that are found in the world and remakes them into an entirely new form of body. But I want to close with the artist Edie Fake. And again, the Des Moines Art Center has two fantastic Edie Fake works that are anchoring the exhibition, so I thought it appropriate to close with this work. One of those works, Potential Donor, represents the body as well, but it does it through an abstraction at the cellular level. The question of the introduction of a new organ, the potential donor in the title, the thinking about this new organ and its acceptance or rejection is for Fake a way to grapple with the larger questions of bodily transformation and of remaking the body that many transgender people experience in different degrees. As well, this is also more than the representation of a single body, but it's an evocation of two bodies meeting and joining. Isn't that what an organ transplant involves? This coupling, however, is not given a specified gender or even reliant on sexual organs, but rather it's a way of thinking both about the transformable body and of how bodies meet and come together in a way that references anatomy, but without relying simply on a representation of the erotically available body or of genitals or of sexual contact. And so this is left open in a deeper way, and that's one of the things that I would argue many of these queer artists do, is give us a deeper way of identifying individually and particularly for ourselves through the openness of the abstract forms that they're giving us. And in a way, ultimately, this work allows us to think not just of the body that's being transformed, but also through the a sexuality that's not necessarily defined by the genders of its participants. So the final work I want to talk about is also in the show, and it's a work that I've thought a lot about and spent a lot of time with. And this is Vanity Mirror from 2013. Now, this again, at first appears to be an abstract design. It may come into view as a representation if we take the title seriously. It promises an image that's the mirror that it's supposed to be. But this mirror does not reflect ourselves back. Rather, it forces us to ask what we're looking for by not giving us the image that it promises. It's a mirror that doesn't reflect but is opaque, that the more we look into, the less we see. Fake's work is tied up with narratives of gender self-determination as well as queer communities and histories. His work often looks to queer histories to see where he might have or could fit, and issues of gender possibility and exclusion are central in the larger questions that he's interested in. The more recent abstract works seem to remix signs for gender and bodies, like with Potential Donor, and Vanity Mirror was a key transitional work in all of this. It's one of Fake's first one-to-one scale images, in that it's not, he was previously doing representations of architecture and buildings. It presages some of the later works, such as the two in the Des Moines Art Center collection. More than this, however, this makes the scene of reflecting on the self and its place central and performative. When we approach the vanity mirror, isn't that what we're looking for ourselves? When we face this work, we don't see our own image, as the title might promise, but rather are forced to ask what we're looking for. We see ourselves in this work not as a figure, but as a field of possibilities. When each of us look at this work, we might look at the same forms, but we are going to imagine differently. This is the lesson that Fake, I believe, wants us to take to the other mirrors and the other people that we see in the world. This is, for me, what a queer abstraction can do. It prompts us to image and to imagine otherwise. It does not delimit how we can recognize ourselves or each other. Rather, it complicates the idea that seeing is knowing, and it demands that we spend time to get to know the individual complexity of a thing, be it a painting or a person, and recognize that complexity for what it is doing, saying, and being in front of us. Queer abstraction, in this sense, is an ethical and not just an aesthetic proposition, since it asks us to take new forms, unfamiliar forms, on their own terms, and love them for what they do differently. This is a resistance to a narrow view of identity politics, as well as a resistance to an attempt to surveil, scrutinize, and endanger. Both of the terms of visibility that I started with. A queer abstraction seeks in its openness to both avoid a narrow view of how we might recognize something that falls outside of the normal, but it does so in a way that allows space for each of us. Queer abstraction resists such protocols of surveillance and recognition, but it asks us to look otherwise for all that's previously been excluded. With that, I'll end. Thank you very much. So I'd be thrilled to take any questions. Everything's on the table. There are 2 microphones on either side, and so we would, I won't be able to hear you unless the microphone comes to you. So if you raise your hand, we'll get one to you, please.
Well, I wanted to ask, I'm struck by how often letters and letter forms and text are hidden in the images or are part of what's considered to be abstraction. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, because the usual assumption about abstraction is it's either going to be a representational figure or something that isn't recognizable at all. But letter forms, why do you think that's been, I mean, I have ideas too. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that has been so dominant? And it seemed like about a third of these images had letter forms, or pieces of letter forms.
Mm-hmm. And this, as I mentioned with Kelly in Indiana, this is actually one of the key debates in the history of abstraction over the past 70 years, or actually the past 100 years, is what counts as abstraction. Need an abstract work be purely unrecognizable, or can there be recognizable images in it? The letter is crucial because it does some really interesting things. On its own, a letter doesn't mean anything, right? If I give you a J, what is it? It's a J. We can recognize a J, but it doesn't mean anything until it's rubbed up against other things and made into a word and given to meaning. So in that ability, that kind of compartmentalization and component form, the letter actually brings with it some of the debates around abstraction of how a form can come to have meaning. So the curved form of the J, I have to do it backwards, right? Did I get it right? No, okay, like that. So the curved form of the J is not a meaningful thing in the world, but because it's repeated in our vocabulary again and again and again, when we see that curved form, we then recognize it. So that's actually the production of meaning out of an abstraction. It's for that reason so many artists have played with the boundaries between letters and forms, but also used words for their own inherent doubleness of meanings, which is the extension of some of that. So it's both about the meanings of words, but specifically about letters are all of these abstract forms that we have repeated enough and are familiar with us that we now think they're no longer abstract.
We looked around the gallery before the talk, mm-hmm. and now understand far more about what's going on. Is it the expectation of the artist that we would just react blindly, or is the artist expecting us to research around to find out what the symbols and the background and context of the pictures are?
Now, this is the key question for all art, right? I know there's some artists in the room. Artists will say that they want their works to speak for themselves and to just be apparent. And so they both want that work to talk to us directly through the visual and its mobilization of that visual experience. But at the same time, no one invents a new language, just like that. It takes a community of people working with similar practices, similar forms. Indeed, it takes a whole history of the accumulation of work that actually starts to give context. And so the larger question for all art is how the more art you see, the more the work starts to make sense, because artists themselves are using a shared vocabulary. When it comes to the specific works themselves, there is an understanding that there are different ways into any work of art. Sometimes, no matter how famous the painter or sculptor is, if they're your neighbor or your best friend, you're going to know more about their work than if it's someone you never met. And so there's always this kind of push and pull between that. What many artists intend, and I don't want to speak for them, but what many artists intend is that they open up different questions. They channel their enthusiasms, their own research and history into works, and they expect that a good amount of that will never be for anyone other than themselves. And that's okay. And that's not the problem of abstraction, that's the problem of art in general, of everything that's loaded into it. But the abstraction brings to the surface these questions in a different way. Now, let's remember that any image is not immediately recognizable to us unless we start to bring to bear our knowledge and our comparison of things in the world to it. So any work of art requires some outside work, some outside reading or thinking or knowing other works, because there's no work of art that fully gives itself to us, even if it's just an image of a vase of flowers. So for instance, there's an excellent installation of early 20th century flower paintings on view right now. And you can go in and you can experience them all and be like, I like flowers. These are nice paintings of flowers. And they look good, and you're like, okay, I've got it. But the more you know, the more you realize that some of those flowers, some of those peaches that are in a bowl are actually deeply agonistic competitive works with other artists, and that they're playing against each other, and that we can just see a group of flowers or an image of Mont Sainte-Victoire by Marsden Hartley without knowing that that painting, with all of its fantastic pastels, is actually a competition with Paul Cézanne, who also famously painted that mountain. And so I'm just trying to get you to go to more galleries at the MAC. But I'm using this example, and sorry I don't have the images, to remind us that abstraction distills some of these problems and opportunities, but they're actually the feature of all artistic practice. And that's okay. That's part of it being a specialized language. And we should understand that that art both tries to reach as wide an audience as possible, but also is the result of lifelong dedication and research and practice and work by artists who can't just be immediately available on first glance.
I was wondering about you mentioned one of the works being camp, and I'm just really trying to learn a little bit more about when something is camp, do artists struggle with intentionally making it camp and then not having it be valued as fine art because it's campy, but they still want to push their message by being camp?
Yeah, no, I know I shouldn't have mentioned that word, because that's a whole other lecture about camp. So it's a few quick words. First, camp has nothing to do with what just happened at the Met Ball and those outfits. So just bracket that, throw that to the side. Briefly, I'm going to give you my working, quick definition of camp. Camp is a queer practice of appropriation in reading and viewing in which things that are devalued, kitsch, excessive emotion and other things, the things that are pushed to one side and devalued are valued as being heroically important. And it's that reversal of the ways in which power is distributed culturally. Oh, that Hummel figurine, that image of Judy Garland, these are not culturally, culturally meaningful. It's the taking of those things that are disregarded and said, no, it's deeply meaningful, right? Like that, macrame pot hanger, or that Hummel figurine that everyone else thinks should just be resigned to the thrift store or the dustbin. I'm going to love like it's the Shroud of Turin, and that activity is a defiant mode of taking the things that are devalued and valorizing them. That manifests itself both in the making of camp, but also in the reception of existing cultural objects. So when an artist, say like Tom Burr, is playing with this idea, he's taking very devalued things. That particular color, purple, is a really hard one to find in the history of art. It's a little excessive, right? It's the ways in which he's taking these elements that might be seen as too much, and then applying them to this other work is sometimes, and in the literature on Burr's Deep Purple, is talked about in relationship to that revaluing of the devalued. Sometimes you have, or in the exhibition, someone like Mark Joshua Epstein is also playing with vocabularies of excessive decoration that are often seen to be just a little too much, but then he's celebrating them. The problem is that, yes, when you start trying to create intentional camp, it's easy for it to then activate those hierarchies in different ways. Sometimes it falls flat. Sometimes people don't respect that work in the same way. But it's just sheer commitment that keeps it going. Another work in the DMAC collection that you should go look at, there's a fantastic work by Nick Cave, which is the thing. I mean, Nick is one of my colleagues at the School of the Art Institute, and that work is like full-on camp. But it's also deeply serious, relates to all of these larger questions of who ascribes value, what is the visual culture of communities that are not valued. And so there's a way in which that is important, and it's only the kind of commitment that work goes through. So, and that's the dynamic. I'm probably not answering your question directly, but that's sometimes the way out of that. But that's really a whole different lecture. I'm sorry if that was confusing. So.
Well, we'll invite you back to give that lecture because we all want to hear it now, for sure. Thank you for your lecture.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.